Thank you very much, Andrea, for the generous introduction. It actually sounds a lot fancier than what I feel it is. And in the same vein, I would like to follow up, first of all, by making it clear that this is a joint effort. This is not just me, right? I am at Zoom now, but I'm representing the work of many more people from many different fields. Uh, This specific talk is on the actually a summary sort of this recent paper. So if you miss anything, either email me or you can also read it up. Okay, so let's talk first about Gregorian chant a little bit. So, in case you haven't done a music history class, Gregorian chant is the vocal monody of the Latin Church. So, Roman Catholic these days, historically, it's easier to define it as Latin. And the musical form is generally just vocal monody. So, you sing a melody, that's it. It's a liturgical thing. So the performance itself is a ritual, leaving aside modern day concert performances. And importantly, it for a long time was an oral tradition and sung primarily from memory. We do have, though, its written form, which is quite beautiful, I have to say, very often. And this was done in order to enforce conservation, so that if it's a liturgical thing, right, and you have to remember a lot of melodies, you have to remember over 2,000 melodies for the liturgical year. Uh, Having a book where you can check if you still got it is quite essential. Uh, So what do these books work like? Well, on this page, you can kind of guess. But this red stuff, this is the rubric, and it tells you that this particular chant that begins, or this particular segment of chants that begins after the rubric, is for some specific point in the liturgical calendar. So in this case, in Vigiliam Assumptionis Beatae Maria Virginis is a feast that falls on August 15th. And there are some further details in the rubric about which specific liturgy this particular chant belongs to. That's what the tradition looks like. And because, of course, it's a couple hundred years old, we don't really have any medieval singers around. The written material is the primary way that we can engage with this. Chant is huge. It really was a deliberate identity marker of Latin Europe. This has to do with the Frankish Empire, right? From the year 754, and then especially from the year 800, there was a concerted effort to get everybody in the Frankish Empire, so today this is mostly France and Germany and parts of Italy, uh, to sing in liturgy in the same way. And this effort was quite successful, and Gregorian chant has really become the dominant auditory expression of religion in this area, so of Catholic Christianity, for well up to the 1970s actually. And the great thing for computational study is that this tradition has these clear identifiable units. So you can really tell if you look into two places of two manuscripts, you really can tell, is this the same chant or not? And this is a great situation to be in compared to many other traditions, which might not have so clear boundaries between what are its like units of repertoire. And given how huge it was, we have over 30,000 extant chant manuscripts. And this is just like 5% of all of the medieval production, but still this is a lot. So chant is huge, and chant is kind of amenable to computational work. Chant is also digital. So for the past 40 plus years, the Cantus database has been around. It's, I think, one of the great success stories of digital humanities or digital musicology. It has almost 500,000 records these days, and because why have just one chant database when you can have 19? There is also the Cantus index, federated search interface for 18 more chant databases, which are much smaller, but in total they now have over 1 million records. There's more than 500 full sources indexed, more than 2,000 fragments. So we have a lot of digital chant data to play with. Chant, despite this origin story of a unified authoritative liturgy, is still pretty diverse. So even though a lot of effort was put into the rules of what should be sung exactly when and into writing this down, even the development of exact pitch notation was driven by the need to memorize quickly the melodies as they should be. Still within this, there is considerable diversity. So for instance, already in the repertoire choices, so what gets sung for which occasion, for instance, this is Palm Sunday, so this is the Sunday before Easter. You can see that there is a bunch of different sub-traditions within Gregorian chant according to what repertoire they choose for that particular feast. So there is this Western part, which is blue stuff. There is this Eastern tradition, which is the purple stuff. And then the Cistercian order, which are white monks, they have their own thing, which is the yellow squares. Um, And chant, finally, is a really great problem to have if you want to be doing computational musicology. Already, these internal sub-traditions are not really known and not well described. The relationship to other traditions that Gregorian chant has displaced is also not quite clear. There is now a huge project working on the development of music notation for chant. We know very little about how it was actually sung, and we don't really understand how its melodies are constructed. So there is really a lot of opportunity for computational musicology here. And my favorite problem is the problem of melodic dialects. So what do I mean by that? Well, you were supposed to remember melodies exactly. This picture is an iconographical expression of that requirement where the melodies were sacred. So the origin story for them, the legend, is that this Holy Spirit in the form of a dove sung the melodies to Pope Gregory the First, and Gregory the First dictated them to somebody who wrote, and this is like authoritative. You really, therefore, must recall the melodies exactly as they are supposed to go. The problem is you didn't have exact notation for pitch between the year 800 and the year 2000, 1050-ish. So you had to remember all of this. And even then, when you do get music notation, it's copying it in manuscripts. There is no Control C, Control V, right? You have to actually write everything down, and that is prone to errors. Scribal errors are a thing for all of like medieval manuscript culture. Plus, there were some deliberate redactions. So even though you were supposed to remember melodies exactly, the transmission methods at your disposal were not exactly great at preserving things, the way they should have been. So when you look into manuscripts and you look at different instances of the same chant, it practically never happens that they are actually written exactly the same way. It's clear that it's the same, it's supposed to be the same melody, but in details, it's not. Some, though, are a bit more similar than others. So if we look at just these three sites of variability out of many more, we can maybe see that there is structure. And maybe these sort of melodic dialects might have some, I don't know, regional connections or institutional ones. So maybe the monks of one order sing in a different way than monks from another order or something like that. This has actually already been identified in chant scholarship. So most famous is the West Frankish versus East Frankish split, where already this German musicologist Peter Wagner identified a possible split in 1925. And this is basically with the border on the river Rhine. So France is West Frankish and Germany is East Frankish. And then when in the 1960s there was an attempt to make a critical edition of Gregorian chant, also some regional patterns were observed and people identified the provenance of manuscripts, sometimes also according to the style of the melody. There are some melodic redactions known, etc., etc. But it's not quite clear how exactly these melodic dialects apply across this huge repertoire. And it's not at all clear whether they are actually like musically consistent because you can just get into a situation where they are caused by a bunch of scribal errors that get copied over and over and over and because scribal copying requires physical presence, it's restricted to a particular region. So it looks like, okay, Germany has a different preference for how melodies should go than France, but maybe it's just a bunch of, random errors in the first manuscript that was used for chant in Germany. So melodic dialects of chant are a topic which is underdeveloped, where so far all of this work has been really manual and not quite replicable. It's a great fit for computational methods. And there's also way too much chant to do this by hand. But let's get back to this idea that some melodies are more similar than others. Maybe we can get more out of it. So, okay, B and C seem the most similar here. Then D is the next one. E is the next most similar. And finally, there is A, which has a really different beginning, right? On the first side, something quite different. Now, if you turn this kind of 90 degrees, what if this reflects sort of the transmission history? Like you're accumulating some errors over time as people learn the melodies and teach them to the next generation of singers, etc. If you turn this 90 degrees, you get a tree like this. And if you've done any philology at all, then you should be getting very strong stematological vibes because this is how people talk about manuscript traditions and how they structure history of manuscript copying. This was done for, biblical texts and various for Homeric texts, etc., etc. So maybe we can do this something in this style also for chant melodies, because what we would get from such a thing is possibly the map of chant transmission. And because chant was this major identity marker of Latin Europe, and it was everywhere where the church was. Basically, if we can map chant transmission, we can map a lot of the cultural networks that gave Europe or gave medieval Europe a layer of like shared culture. So if we talk about a shared European identity now, maybe if we look through chant melodies, we can figure out how this shared identity may have been constructed in the Middle Ages. I hope that is exciting. So let's do a quick recap of the research questions. First of all, do melodic dialects in Gregorian chant exist? Are there really these systematic differences in melody? If yes, what are their historical correlates? So, do we have a development of Gregorian melodies in time? Can we tell older melodies apart from newer ones? Or maybe we can tell them apart by place of origin. Maybe we can tell them apart by which institution they belong to. And there is this sort of stretch goal that maybe we can actually map the transmission history of Gregorian chant, and with it, the history of how the church worked and connected different places of Europe. Okay, that was chapter one. And chapter two, now we get into the methods part of this with a gentle introduction to phylogenetics. So I do apologize to those who already know what phylogenetics are, but I have a nagging feeling that this might not be everybody in the room. So, phylogenetics are tools for estimating how the tree of life is structured. This drawing on the top right is actually by Charles Darwin. Fundamentally, what this does is trying and trace evolutionary relationships between populations. And typically, your populations are species. So one population is like, all the spiders who look like that. And another population is all the spiders who are a bit more brown, etc. And you can also have subpopulations. You can do phylogenetics for like human populations, actually, right? A lot of what we know about tracing the history of human expansion across the globe is done from phylogenetics. Originally, the way you would construct these trees of life would be from what things look like, right? Do they have hair? Do they have wings? How many teeth do they have? But nowadays, most of this is done with biological sequences. So DNA, RNA, proteins, and the word evolution actually can be understood a bit more abstractly than just in the biological domain. It can be understood to be any sort of process of descent with modification. So there is some, you know, unit of information that replicates over time, and this process of replication might not be perfect. And you should already probably see where this is going, but let's talk a bit more about how phylogenetics work. If I can get zoomed to. Okay, so the basic structure that you're working with in phylogenetics is a tree. How does this tree work? So time goes in this direction, like from the smaller part to the richer part of the tree, usually. This is a node. The nodes on the end of the tree are called leaves or tips, and typically these are the observed uh, representatives of your populations, right? So you sample frogs or lizards, and those are the tips of your phylogenetic tree. And then what you're trying to do is infer where these internal nodes are. And what this node represents is that the descendants of that node shared an ancestor. So up to this point, their evolutionary history was shared. This is a branch. The important thing about branches is length and which nodes they connect. This is also a branch, right? Also connecting a node, an internal node with a tip. And this area right here is the root. And we actually will not go into too much detail there because we don't have to. So how would you build such a tree when you have a bunch of observation? Right? You saw a couple of lizards. How do we infer a tree? So the first principle for this is parsimony. You use the tree, which models the differentiation towards your observed diversity with the fewest changes in total. This is just a fancy way of saying Occam's razor, right? The simplest tree wins, and simple means that things don't have to evolve more than once, or things have to evolve as few times as possible, right? So what would this look like? Okay, let's make a table for our four little lizards, and we mark which of them have certain traits. So like Doug has tail spines, Carol and Doug have marks, Alice and Bob have horns, and Alice has a crest. And let's say this is a proposed phylogenetic tree, and we're trying to figure out how parsimonious it is. So we find out where from the root to the leaves things had to evolve. And we see that here we have to do 6 changes, right? But we only are evolving 4 traits. So maybe this is kind of inefficient. We've had to evolve horns twice, and we've had to evolve marks twice, if this was the evolutionary history for our 4 lizards. So let's try a different tree. What if it looked like this? Now we only have to evolve horns once, right? Because Bob and Alice have a shared ancestor. But then again, if you look at this, you have to unevolve horns for Carol. So again, it's 6 changes. And again, it's an inefficient tree. It's not very parsimonious. Okay, let's try this one. Or this is how we would draw it. Now we only evolve horns for Alice and Bob over here. And when we do the rest, it's 5 changes because we are still evolving marks twice. But okay, this is already easy to solve. We do it like this. We only evolve horns once, marks once, and then we are at 4 changes, and this is optimal because we need to evolve 4 traits. So you cannot get there in less than 4 changes. There are, of course, way too many phylogenetic trees to really try them all this way. So this is a hard combinatorial problem. So already with like 11 nodes, you have like over 2 billion trees. Fortunately, for finding parsimonious trees, there is the neighbor joining algorithm, which is super simple. We just infer a common ancestor for the species which are most similar in terms of their traits. So like here, it would be Alice and Bob. And then we just do it again and again. And we get through this parsimonious tree. For sequence data, so far we have worked with trait data or morphological data in the language of biology. For sequential data, instead of this trace table, we just have an alignment. So we align the sequences, and then some positions are actually informative. They help us distinguish which groups of species, in this case pine trees, share more of an evolutionary history than other species, right? So here we need the positions which are different. Parsimonious trees have a lot of issues, actually. They're simple to explain, but they find it hard to differentiate between different kinds of changes. And they have pretty serious statistical consistency issues. So you're not always guaranteed to converge to an actual tree. Like this comes from simulation studies as well as from studies with real data. So what instead people do is work with probabilistic models of evolution. And this, I think, is very close to the heart of anyone who is doing MIR, right? Because most of what we do has to do with statistics and probabilistic modeling. So you specify the probabilities of trait states changing into one another. So in the case of like horns, it's a 2 by 2 matrix, right? You have no horns, and then you also have no horns. You evolve horns, you lose horns, or you keep horns. And this is a 4 by 4 matrix, right? And this gives you some probabilities. For DNA, sorry, 2 by 2. For DNA or RNA models, you have 4 by 4 matrices for nucleotides. For proteins, it's a bit more complicated. You have a 20 by 20 matrix approximately. But uh, you just have to make a few other assumptions about rates of change, and then you can actually evaluate the probability of a tree given your observation. So given your trait table or given your alignment, if you have a model of evolution specified. And you can therefore, apply all of the statistical tools at our disposal to find, for instance, an optimal phylogeny under this given model of evolution with maximum likelihood methods. Or you can do the cool thing and you can go fully Bayesian, yay. And you just find the complete posterior distribution over phylogenetic trees with your model of evolution and your data. And actually, this is suspiciously similar to the process we did with the parsimony example, where this is done with Markov chain Monte Carlo. So basically, yeah, you're just like trying new trees based on some mutation operators, etc. But in the end, because you can do it with a model of evolution as Bayesian inference, you really actually can find a posterior over phylogenetic trees. So this is what we do, right? Chant melodies can be aligned, and it's just like, then we do phylogeny over an alignment with a different alphabet. Coming as surprise to few people, right? That we can try and do this. So instead of pine trees, we have manuscripts. Instead of, the chloroplast gene, we have a specific antiphon from Christmas liturgy. So each manuscript, which is our unit of analysis here, is a species or samples a species or some subpopulation of Gregorian chants. Uh, each cognate melody works as a gene. So like this specific unit of repertoire is one gene, and we align the specific melodies from that one underneath each other. This is why it's important that chant has these clearly identifiable units of repertoire, because now we know what's supposed to be aligned with what. And we have the Volpiano encoding for encoding our pitches. And then the computational step here is to actually just find the optimal phylogeny. And this should reflect, hopefully, the most likely transmission history for a given set of manuscripts. And if the structure, if there is sufficient structure in melodic differentiation, so if there really are some melodic dialects, then we should be able to resolve a tree, right? We should be able to resolve a very likely tree compared to alternative topologies. So the method is we take a bunch of melodies transcribed from a bunch of manuscripts. We have to use the same melodies from every manuscript. We align them. We steal the muffed tool, which is good with arbitrary alphabets. And then we do Bayesian phylogeny inference to actually create the tree. But wait, is chant transmission really sufficiently similar to biological evolution? Well, it's not the same process, really, but maybe it's similar enough. So the fundamental assumptions of phylogenetics is that this is an evolutionary process. So there is some descent with modification. We have homologous comparable units, and the tree structure is not completely stupid. So there has to be a root, and there has to be predominantly single inheritance. So you inherit from just one ancestor or one ancestral environment, not like you don't hybridize too much. So let's check if these assumptions hold for chant. So we do have a root. We have an originating environment, right? This was an effort by the Carolingians in the late 8th and early 9th century to standardize liturgy. And we know that really like there was this center, and from this center, people were going out across the empire, like scholars, and they were saying, okay, this is how you should do liturgy now. There is quite a bit of documentation about this. And this was disseminated via certain trained practitioners, right? This way, and along the way, you have this network of new dioceses and new monasteries coming up. And because this was this identity marker, just going back to this Gregorian legend of doves singing to Pope Gregory I, you really were supposed to conserve this. And we have multiple records of like different abbots or cantors or other authorities who we know would really correct what people sang. There's something by Rudolf, by a biographer of one famous abbot who says, yeah, he corrected day and night, he was listening and would make sure that you were singing it right. So how does this transmission work? You go to school to become a cleric. I mean, that's a pretty good life, right? One of the few chances of at a pretty good life in the Middle Ages. There you learn the melodies of Gregorian chant. Takes up to 10 years if you really have to learn this by heart before pitch notation is there. And you learn this from a cantor or from a book or cross-referencing with a book. But this is the single authority, right? You don't learn it by going into a bunch of places and listening and then synthesizing your own version. You learn it from a single authority. And then sometimes you might be tasked with moving to some other place and establish liturgy there. And then you might have to make a copy of the liturgical books to make sure that you're teaching the new guys the right way. So this is an opportunity for a new manuscript to spring into existence. And then some of these we have actually left over from the Middle Ages. Or maybe you become a cantor for the new guys, and you then are the authority which is teaching in the old place, and you're sort of keeping this transmission chain going. And what this discussion leads to is I want you to imagine chant transmission as this like process of Chinese whispers, melodic transmission chains that sometimes just continue, sometimes they branch out because there is a new place established, and sometimes they produce a manuscript, like a fossil. The closest analogy is really what paleophylogenetics do, which is, okay, there's dinosaurs, they reproduce, sometimes they split into different species, and sometimes they die in just the right way so that their fossil falls into the right, like stays there in the right kind of rock for us to find. So I hope this analogy is kind of clear that we have these melodic transmission chains going on through time and that you're supposed to conserve things. But remember, the transmission processes are imperfect, so some changes accumulate. So we do get this process of descent with modification, right? Conservation objectives, but changes, we know changes were happening. And there is a decent balance between conservation and mutation. So it's obvious that there are changes all the time, but at the same time, there is not so many changes that they obscure the melodic identity, right? We still can tell, okay, these two chants are supposed to have the same melody because they're supposed to be the same chant. We have these identifiable units, And we kind of have the tree structure as well. We have this root environment in Carolingian Metz, and we have predominantly single inheritance. So compared to pretty much any other cultural domain, we are actually adhering to the assumptions of phylogenetic trees like really, really well. The tree structure, of course, is imperfect. Even in chant, there will have been some horizontal transmission, right? So like this dude moves to some other place and two of them get together and they say, okay, well, maybe we should sing it like that, and you get this hybridization event where a reduction to the melody is made. But I mean, there are phylogenetic network models when we exhaust trees. We should check for tree likeness, and we can check whether this tree assumption holds. But a priori, I think we're in a pretty safe spot with modeling chant transmission as a tree. And I want to make here a certain like epistemological detour, right? Because of course you can say, but you don't really know how chant was transmitted. You weren't there. You weren't able to observe it in the way that we are able to observe processes of biological reproduction, basically. Uh, but we have sufficient knowledge maybe to extrapolate. Like in biology, again, phylogenetics operates on the basis of knowledge about this replication process, and you just have to know enough about it and let the model do its work. And then when you learn more about it, you update your models, right? You make a better model of evolution. And this is a process that the biologists are still working on, right? You still get some updates to these substitution matrices for certain regions of the genome, etc., etc. So we are not in a substantially worse position here than the natural sciences because we know enough about this transmission process to apply this model, even though compared to much of what's done in MIR, there is no ground truth. Like at the end of this paper, there is no evaluation metric that tells you how right you really are. You have to trust the model. You have to have a good reason to trust the model. And then the outputs of the model are your result. And there is like nothing to check it against too much. What we can do, of course, is check some details against the knowledge of history that we have. And this is what we are going to do later. But this research has a different epistemological structure than your usual machine learning slash computational probabilistic modeling paper. Okay, back from our brief epistemological detour. So we get the second round of research questions, which I actually think are even more interesting than the first round, which is, can we actually use phylogenies for this kind of large-scale study of chant melody? Is this a good method? And basically the experiments that we are getting very close to, these are not particularly large scale. It's a pilot for this class of method. And we want to check if chant melody and the development of chant melody and chant transmission is something that we can really model using these methods. Given all the reasons I have just given to expect that this is the case, we still need to go and check. And for the humanities people in the room, I think a huge part of this is just because the material is a humanities domain doesn't mean you cannot really check with empirical methods, and you can go for this standard of proof that the natural sciences have. Okay, experiments. So what data set do we have? We have the Christmas data sets, which is really tiny. It's just 14 manuscripts, 6 melodies from each, about 500 notes per manuscript. And you can see the geographical distribution there. And most of these manuscripts are from like regular parish churches and cathedrals. And a few of them are from Cistercian monasteries, and a few of them are from Benedictine monasteries. They are like different groups of monks. And we have another data set that takes melodies from a different part of liturgy, and this is a bit larger. And we have 23 manuscripts here and 20 transcribed melodies from each, about 2,500 notes transcribed per manuscript. So this is somewhere above 50,000 notes in total. And we do the same experiments on both. So, is this representative? Well, obviously not quite, right? But at least we do have coverage of both main types of liturgy, like the public liturgies and the private liturgies that the clerics would do. We have at least decent geographic coverage, so like it's not all clumped in France. And most importantly, this is about the method and it's extensible. If this works, and if this is shown to be a good way of modeling chant transmission, we can always add manuscripts later. Okay, what did we get? So this is the tree this is the Christmas tree. Um, so this is out of the posterior distribution over trees. This is the summary tree. I show you here all the nodes, all the internal nodes that were inferred to be there with at least 50% probability. So they are more likely to be there than not. And what structure can we see? Well, there is this bluish part. Those are the Cistercian monks, and they are super closely related. Like the thickness of the edge is the strength, is like the closeness of their relationship. So the Cistercian melodies are very, very similar to each other, regardless of where they are. And the rest of the manuscripts, or the rest of the tree, rather, is distributed kind of on the map. So you go from France, you have one in the Low Countries, then you have something in Germany and Switzerland, and then you have stuff in the East in Bohemia. Okay, what does the results for the introits look like? It's a bit messy because there is more manuscripts, but there is a similar structure here. So we have this blue-ish network of Cistercians, which are really closely related. We have this olive branch of Italians slash Franciscans, and there is one manuscript from the Franciscan monastic order, and those originated in Italy, so it makes sense that it's clumped together with Italian manuscripts. Then we have this branch that goes into southern France. This is the one which ends with the two green boxes. Those are Carthusian monasteries, whatever, southern France. We have this part, which are manuscripts from the east of the Rhine, which are not Cistercian. So this is the purple stuff. This comes from the east. And actually, if you take a close look, you will see that this N24 thingy up there in Italy, what is it? That's Italian, right? What is it doing here? It turns out that in the 12th and 13th century, which is when this manuscript comes from, this part of Italy was ruled by the Habsburg dynasty already from Austria. So it does make sense, after all, that this particular manuscript is grouped with this Eastern German slash Austrian branch here. And then the rest in the middle comes from northern France and the vicinity of Paris. And here, of course, it's a bit messy. Like, for instance, this particular node has support of only 54%. So if you're looking at this, you probably shouldn't, like, base your next grant application about chant on the fact that this node exists. But still, the model thinks it's more likely than not that there was a common ancestor. And in this case, the common ancestor is not necessarily one book, but a common ancestral environment in which somebody was singing, right? This tree is a tree of those melodic transmission chains of those Chinese whispers. So there was some community which split up, and some of them went to Italy and some of them went elsewhere. Okay. What about the tree likeness? So I've been showing you trees, but then I warned you also that you should not maybe trust that this is entirely a tree-like structure. So we check. There is this tool called delta plots. The lower it is, the more tree-like your data are. So it turns out that chant melody is pretty similar to how tree-like languages are. And there is a whole field in like historical linguistics which does phylogenetics on languages. So we're kind of safe. Chant is much more tree-like than folktale data. Some people have been doing phylogenies for the history of different folktale, like Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella or Juan Oso in Southern America. And it turns out that chant is quite a bit more tree-like than these. And we are approximately as tree-like as some biological data sets, which are known to contain some non-tree-likeness, some hybridization, some horizontal gene transfer, etc. But it's not terrible. So we're mostly safe with the tree assumptions, at least, as far as comparison to other fields is concerned. What about the topological uncertainty? So we saw this best topology, right? But is there a second best topology that looks completely different? Turns out not so much. The major difference between the first two topologies is where the Italian clade is attached to the rest of the tree. And already that was a place where the tree, like the first summary tree warned us. I'm super uncertain about that point. Unfortunately, the most likely tree for the introids is more than 3 times as likely as the second most likely tree. So at this point, like the difference, it's not amazing, but still, if you were, for instance, in the medical field, a Bayes factor of 3 is something where you say, okay, there is something here, that there is a clear effect happening. So these are some reasons to trust the trees that we produce. There is actually an important assign here. So we went for the fancy models, right? For the Bayesian stuff right away. Actually, no, we did try parsimonious models and they did not work at all. So the choice of model matters, really. If the simple neighbor joining trees don't give you nice results, don't give up. The fancy stuff might help because this result makes no sense at all with parsimony. Uh, We also looked at this topological uncertainty in more summaries, and I won't go into the details, but this is just to show that there is a huge amount of tools that help you assess your results, even if you don't have ground truth to measure F-scores against. Right? You can look at, okay, this is like this uncertain part. The Bohemian clade is super uncertain, so probably we shouldn't trust that too much either, etc., etc. This is stuff you can do with Bayesian phylogenies. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that it makes sense to build a tree. What melodic dialects did we find? So we considered time of origin, place of origin, and institution of origin as like possible factors that organize melodies into dialects or that correlate with how melodies are organized into dialects. So are melodic features going to help us place a manuscript in time, in place, or by institution? And none of this was a part of the inference, right? The inference only had melodies to work with. And we look into like ecology a little bit, and we find that to assess this, there is a class of methods called phylogenetic signal. And if there is high signal, this just measures correlation between a trait and phylogenetic distance of species that exhibit this trait. And so if there is high signal for a trait, it says things that look similar in this respect share a lot of evolutionary history. And if there is low signal, it's okay, these things do look similar. All these lizards have horns, but it's not related to their evolutionary history because maybe there is convergent evolution. For some reason, all these lizards live in a place where it's really advantageous to evolve horns. And there are many formulations of phylogenetic signal, both for continuous and discrete traits, and we pick a few of these, and then we encode time, place, and origin, an institution of origin for all the manuscripts, and we do it in several different ways so that the result is not like a slave to a particular way of encoding a region. And we measure phylogenetic signal, and we find that actually there are no new versus old versions of the melodies, that time does not play a role in this structure of melodic dialects. On the other hand, though, place is really consistently related. So things that come from close by tend to have similar melodies. This makes sense, right? Transmission mostly took place locally. Apparently, just the Cistercian network overcame this. And notably, proximity is maybe more defined by political than topographic borders. So you have from linguistics, you have this idea that languages get diversifying more in mountains, right? Because there is just less contact. But apparently for chant, this applying these principles would not work that well because we had this North Italian thing from a Habsburg holding, which was across the Alps from the rest of the Habsburg, and still like the melodies look like Austria, not like the rest of Italy. But this is more of an indication of what to look for next than like a strong result, of course. The institution of origin is only important for the Cistercian monks, not for the Benedictines or Augustinians or others. And this also again makes sense because the Cistercians were super strict about copying manuscripts. So if you were trying to start a new Cistercian monastery, you actually had to go back to France and copy from one specific book. And actually, a part of that book survives in a library in Dijon. So it's not so surprising that the Cistercians didn't really differentiate that much, right? But the Benedictine order did not have this mechanism. So there, the locality takes over. And like, none of these results are particularly surprising to chant people. But what is kind of surprising is that we were able to replicate a good couple of years or decades of chant scholarship with, transcribing 20 melodies from 25 manuscripts. Okay, so the topologies are not bad, right? We learned a lot about melodic dialects. We learned that phylogenetic methods probably can work on this domain and like give us useful information, but it's not really the stretch goal of transmission history. So what about this transmission map? What about this history? Well, from topology to go to history, we need to do one operation. We need to take a look at branch lengths. So in phylogenetic trees, the branch length means evolutionary distance. But this is a product of two factors, and one is rate of change, and the other is time. So this how quickly is evolution working here, and how much time it has to work. And the biologists have methods for this. There's divergence time estimation, which is trying to do exactly that, so that we can project the tree into historical time, so that we know how much time actually passes between the inferred nodes and the tips. So we have dates for the manuscripts. We have a date for the root. We know it's around 800 AD. And we can figure out what happens in between with divergence time estimation. So first we have to find the root. We actually can do this also with Bayesian magic, but it just sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we know that the Rhine is a reasonable root because of this Carolingian Metz point of origin. And once we have the root, we can run divergence time estimation. We have to select the right priors for this. And here, the point that I want to make is that for work like this, really having a bioinformatician on your team is essential. First of all, I had no idea divergence time estimation was even a thing. And second of all, even if I had an idea, it would have taken me 2 years to understand how it works and how to set these priors. So if you want to do interdisciplinary work, actually, get people from those disciplines on your team. So Gustavo has been essential in making this all work. Okay, we run DTE. What happens? So for Christmas, we have the root, which was automatically selected on the Rhine. We have this west of the Rhine branch and the east of the Rhine branch. And looky here, this is the fastest evolving branch. What's going on here? Why does this have such a high rate of change compared to all the others? It's red. The redness is the rate of change. Well, it seems that downstream of this branch is this clade of manuscripts from Bohemia. And what happened in Bohemia around the year 1400 is the Hussite Reformation. It got kind of violent, right? This is relatively exceptional historical circumstance. So okay, maybe this somehow changed what how melodies were being sung, right? There's a lot of cultural change, and maybe a lot of places stopped existing and then needed new books, etc., etc. So there's opportunity for change. But then there is this manuscript which is older than the Hussite Reformation. What's going on here? Shouldn't it be like, why would that contribute to the speed of, to the rate of change? Well, I looked into it and turns out that this manuscript is misdated, or more accurately, the melodies in that manuscript are misdated. It was modified later in the 15th century. So there are traces of people erasing the old melody and writing a new one there. So in this picture, it should actually be to the right of the Hussite Reformation line. So what we have here is some extreme value in this model, indicating some extreme historical circumstance, or like something non-typical going on. Another thing we can notice is we look at the most recent common ancestor of all the Cistercian manuscripts, and the median year of origin for that one was predicted by the model to be 1145. There is some uncertainty, but look what happened in 1145. We know that Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was actually doing this Cistercian authoritative book between the years 1140 and 1147. So the DTE step was able to predict when this was supposed to be happening, and this is a rare case when we actually do have ground truth, right? We can check against the historical record, and we find out that the median age is like spot on. Okay, sounds cool. What about the introits? Well, this is not so great, actually. We had to select the route manually because the automated methods did not work. For the Cistercian ancestor, there is like the median age is now 50 years too early. Like the Cistercian order existed already at that point, but for sure they were still figuring out what to do with their melodies. And the uncertainty here is like way too large to do anything musicologically useful, right? It's like plus or minus 100 years. This tells us nothing. And we can, however, again look at this extreme phenomenon, this really fast evolving branch. So what happened here? Well, let me introduce you to the Netflix-worthy story of Arnold of Brescia. So this dude, born in 1096 or so, went to study with Abelard, who was like a famous French intellectual at that time in Paris. And then he went back to the city of Brescia, and he was a bit of a rebel. He thought maybe the church should not be that rich, which is also incidentally something the Hussites were saying 300 years later. But uh, when the bishop of Brescia went away, this dude led an actual armed uprising. They prevented the bishop from returning, and there was like a serious rebellion going on there. In the end, the rebels lost. Arnold was forced to flee to France. By the way, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot, seriously hated this guy. And he kept, like, whenever this guy, wherever Arnold was hiding, Saint Bernard would send letters to whoever was hiding him saying, "You really should not be hiding that guy." And this way he chased Arnold of Brescia all the way to Bohemia for a couple of years. Somehow Arnold was allowed back to Italy to make penance, to kind of say, okay, I'm not a rebel anymore. When he arrived in Rome, there just so happened to be a Republican revolt going on. Arnold of Brescia immediately joined the revolt, became its speaker, and drew the Pope from Rome for a couple of years. So, besides this being an amazing story that I had no idea about, I mean, the Middle Ages were really super wild. What this again tells us is that if there is an extreme phenomenon in our phylogenetic tree, maybe there is some pretty interesting history hiding there. And that there is this adage, like all models are wrong and some are useful. In this case, maybe the model is also useful by where it seems wrong. Okay. Uh, of course, we might not be limited just to chant melodies. We can do work with repertoire. There is now a data set out of this whole Cantus Index network of 19 databases that we might try. If you're interested, I'm for sure looking for collaborators because I really don't have time to check what this tree is doing. Um, but yeah, that's it. So we've shown that melodic dialects of Gregorian chant really exist, and we have shown this at the level of proof that's generally expected in natural sciences. We have shown that these, yes, do follow mostly geographic patterns, that the Cistercians had a strong melodic identity of their own, while other ecclesiastical institutions may not. Uh, we have, I hope, made a pretty convincing case that phylogenetics are a reasonable model for modeling chant transmission, for learning something about how this tradition spread around Europe, even though we really still need to work on this history inference thing. There is hope. Obviously, the Christmas data set, there is hope. But also, we need to reduce this uncertainty by a lot. And I think here we really need a better model of evolution. We need to figure out better how how likely individual modifications to chant melodies might have been. And then we can get the uncertainties maybe down. Also, we need better dates of manuscripts, because if your manuscripts can be from a whole century, maybe that's not good enough to narrow down the time frame for their ancestors. But we do have an extensible and replicable method for chant research. And hopefully, this can also serve as a good example of how to interface between this kind of model-based research of the natural sciences and the humanities. So in the humanities, usually you would work with sources, right? In history, you work with sources that you can observe. And you try to figure out as much as possible from what you see. But model-based research can be construed as a way of taking best guesses about the stuff that you don't see, right? The stuff that was not preserved, like about some of these manuscripts that were just lost. What melodies may have been in there. Uh, so there is this like close reading and distant reading tradition, right? The digital humanities are often associated with this term distant reading, where instead of looking really closely into one book or so, you look at a phenomenon across multiple books, but you don't read all of them. So this kind of goes into a term I've recently heard, is speculative reading. Like you try to guess what's in the books that you haven't even read. Okay, this is basically it. I hope you now have many, many questions.
Great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Very, very fascinating talk. So now questions. So if you have any questions online, please raise your virtual hand, or here in presence if you have questions. Just
maybe I can
okay.
ask.
Okay, we have a question online. Hilda.
You're muted.
Hi, yeah. Now I think. So thank you for your talk. It was amazing. Very, very interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that you have so many data about how the actual transmission works, and even geographical data. I came up with some ideas related to that. But my question is, if you consider like the phrases, because as I understood, you were working with just the melodic description, but I think also the Gregorian chants do have this kind of phrase structure, and I'm wondering if you already work with that, with melodic phrases.
So this would for sure help us to get rid of the constraint that we really need to align just like different instances of the same chant, right? If
Yeah,
we get usable features for this out of just, okay, it's just not the same chant necessarily, but it's the same melodic phrase.
yeah,
This would really help open up like more options for what manuscripts we can include in a single study. But The problem is that we don't like, there is this idea that chant does have these phrases, and in some genres of chant, some have been described, especially for tracts. So there is this body of literature on mode 8 tracts in Gregorian chant that analyzes how they are built from this subset of some phrases. So there, this could be a good enough start to actually work on the phrase level. Um, on the other hand, it's an extra level of uncertainty. So, what actually is a phrase and how to segment them is still a bit of an open problem. And people, even in those tracts, even in those like well-behaved things with strophic structure almost, still
Mm.
there's disagreement about how to split it up.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple of questions as well. So the first one is like in the introduction you mentioned that of course like in this historical period scores were like manually transcribed and this implies that errors were like added to this transcription. So in how do you account for this in this like tree structure? Is this like something that can be assimilated to mutations, like regressive mutations in biology? Or did you do some research on that? Is it like statistically relevant or not?
So, for sure, we include this kind of changes, right? We don't block out any positions. Um, and the fact that something is a scribal error doesn't necessarily mean that it's not the right feature for tracking transmission. For two reasons. First of all, if an error made it to a book, maybe then it's replicated in the next book that's copied from that one, or that's written down by people who learned from the book with the original error. And it still tells us about something about what's like the evolutionary history of a particular melody. And actually, no, that's it. That's that's the main point I think that I wanted to make. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, definitely. Very good. Thanks a lot.
This is actually something that I've come across in when presenting this work to chant scholars. So they apparently really care about the reasons for certain changes. We, at this point, we don't. Like that's the next step to actually study which of these positions that help us resolve a phylogeny, which of these positions are like musically consistent with each other. So is it an aesthetic preference that we're looking at, or are these just like artifacts of, copying mistakes?
Thanks a lot. So we have a couple of questions online. First one is Federico. I think we can't hear you. No.
Federico, maybe try the chat.
Can you hear me? This? No.
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry. I had the wrong device selected. No, I was saying it's a very interesting idea for comparing melodies, and in our project we have a kind of a similar problem that we are starting facing, which is comparing melodies that are from medieval period, in our case Italian popular songs, and I think this can actually be applied, and our problem is how to compute similarities between melodies. So I was wondering if you have uh, talked about evaluating the system with in an information retrieval scenario, like providing queries and evaluating the queries from experts or this kind of idea.
I am not sure how I would actually use this for retrieval. Uh, like we already know, right, that the stuff that we are aligning are instances of the same thing. So there is no retrieving left to do, really. But with respect to the similarity function, that is a very good question. And so far, we have been doing it in the most stupid way possible because it's simple and apparently it works. Kind of. It just might need a bit of improvement. Let me find the thing here. So this custom substitution model for vol piano in the alignment step just penalizes interval size. So like if there is a substitution in the melody, if it's a small substitution, it hurts a little bit, right? If it's a larger one, it hurts more, and the relationship is linear. And this goes back to the lack of knowledge about Gregorian melodies, because if you were doing tonal music, then obviously you should go with different functions that take into account, the like harmonic function or the function of a certain melodic step within tonality. Mongo Sankov distance does this, and there are many other smart ways from music cognition on how to do this. But chant predates all of this, and we don't really have a very good theory of what this should look like. So we went with the simplest thing we could think of, really. At least, though, it's like a bit of a physical model, because if you are singing this, and you have like some memory of how the melody goes. If you're supposed to substitute like far away, it's more movement, right? It's more change in your vocal tract, so it's less comfortable. But
Mhm.
like this is not the best of ideas. This is just the first thing that we kind of tried. And it turns out that actually you can get a lot of mileage out of phylogenetic methods, even if your uh, like decisions of this kind are like obviously not optimal. And this is also the case in biology, right? A lot of mileage was had from phylogenetics before we even started modeling substitution costs between different nucleotides in DNA differently. I think it's A and C, which are like kind of easy to swap, and G and T, which are kind of easy to swap randomly for each other. And then across it's more difficult. But this wasn't really there when the first, model-based phylogenetics was being done.
Yeah, okay.
So the answer is we are in the fortunate position because we are not doing retrieval, really. We are in the fortunate position of not having to care too much about the kind of similarity we are using. Actually, in the phylogeny inference step, the model of evolution that is used here is even more restrictive. And this has to do with implementation constraints for non-biological data. We would have to rewrite the Markov chain Monte Carlo uh, sampler, and this would have taken like all of those past 3 years. Like instead of doing, actual chant work, I'd be stuck implementing this. The approximation there is that like and tone stays the same with some probability, and the remaining probability is split equally across all the possible tones it can change to,
Okay.
which is like, again, this is really not the similarity function you necessarily want. It's not a great model of evolution, really, but it's good enough for a first pass, and it's actually what the tools give us.
No, of course. Thank you.
So we have another question online. Soham, I hope I didn't, sorry if I did mispronounce your name.
No, it's right. Hi, Jan. Uh, nice talk. So, I had a question about the positioning of manuscripts at intermediate nodes in the tree. So, how does the system position them, given we don't use the years in the inference?
Here, like on the map or in this tree?
In the tree example, like on the density tree slide that you showed before.
Right, on the density tree slide.
Yeah.
Density tree randomly picks a route that it likes. Here, the ordering from left to right doesn't mean anything.
Mhm.
Uh,
So, are all the manuscripts at the nodal points or the
all the
leaf points?
all the manuscripts are leaves. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, is that true? Given the source of truth, like, are the manuscripts like some of them are older, some of them are newer, right?
Yes. So but in this step, this doesn't enter into the process at all.
Mm-hmm.
There is a chat like, so there is an approximation that we made here, which is that like in this structure, let me get it, this structure, this is best visible, that like none of the manuscripts are ancestors of each other. So
Mm-hmm.
like, but this, given the sparsity of the record, this is a reasonable assumption to make, right? About 3 to 7% of liturgical manuscripts have survived. So
Mm-hmm.
like you'd have to be in a pretty unique situation to get like two manuscripts which lie on the same transmission path. It gets more possible if you go into really early manuscripts, but because we can only work with manuscripts which already have exact pitch notation, it's not that much of a risk because like all our sources are from the early 12th century and later.
Got it. So, are there any methods to uh, estimate the time also? Suppose we don't know the timeline.
That was this part. So divergence time estimation,
Yeah.
right? The branch length that we got before was just like evolutionary distance. It's some distance. And two things uh, it's a product of two things. And one is rate of change, how fast evolution is, and the second is time, how much time it has to work. And of course, in order to project the phylogeny into time, you want to separate out the time, right? And that's divergence time estimation. And this is a bit complex. I don't really understand how it works, and this is why I have a bioinformatician on the team. uh, but it's doable, though we have to work on this a bit more because before we can really say that this step works for chant, that we found the right parameterization and the right priors and everything.
Okay.
But this
So,
tree,
how much of this is rule-based versus like deep learning, for example?
none of this is deep learning, none of this is rule-based, really. This is a method that has nothing to do with machine learning.
So it's probabilistic.
Yes. Yeah, it's like computational biology. It's yeah, it's Bayesian inference. It's Bayesian modeling.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Great. So seems like we don't have more questions. So again, Jan, it's been great. Thanks a lot again.
Thanks
And
for having me.
yeah, let's keep in touch.
Yeah, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person as originally planned, but yeah, I hope to be able to come at some other time. I will arrange this with Andrea and find a date.
For sure. For sure. We will be welcoming you for sure. Thanks a lot again.
Thanks.